They say the dead rest easy in the Appalachian hills, but that's a lie. Because on the coldest night of 1859, two brothers stood over the same coffin, both claiming the woman inside as their wife. The wind howled through the trees like it knew the truth, like it had seen what those men had done to her, and to each other. By sunrise, one would be missing. The other would never speak again. Before you continue this story, make sure to like and subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a heartbeat of those who never returned home, but never stopped fighting. The Appalachian Mountains of 1859 were a world apart, rugged, silent, and unforgiving. Life in those valleys clung to faith and superstition with equal desperation. Families buried their dead close, prayed hard, and whispered the old mountain tales that kept children from wandering too deep into the woods. But among all the stories the mountain folk passed down, none was told more softly, or feared more deeply, than the story of the Whitlock brothers. Elias and Jonah Whitlock were born 3 winters apart in a small timber settlement near the Kentucky-Virginia border. They were mountain men through and through, broad-shouldered, quiet, and bound by the kind of loyalty that comes only from surviving the same hunger, the same storms, and the same grief. Their mother had died young, and their father had been taken by a mine collapse when they were barely boys. The 2 brothers grew up with nothing but each other, a worn Bible, and the stubborn will of Appalachian blood. Elias, the elder, carried himself with the calm of a preacher, gentle-voiced, steady-handed, the sort who mended fences and prayed before meals. Jonah, on the other hand, burned like a coal fire. He was reckless, fast with a smile, faster with a knife, and had a temper that could turn a summer afternoon into a storm. Yet they were inseparable. People used to say that where one Whitlock went, the other's shadow wasn't far behind. Everything changed the summer Mary Holloway came to town. Mary was the daughter of a traveling minister, a pale-skinned, soft-spoken woman with hair the color of river clay and eyes as green as new spring. The Holloways had come from Tennessee, staying only long enough for her father to preach at the mountain chapel. But in that short span, both brothers met her, and both fell in love. At first it was innocent. Elias fixed her father's wagon. Jonah carved her a wooden comb. They'd both attend sermons just to catch her voice in the hymns. But the mountain air does strange things to lonely men. By autumn, what had begun as quiet admiration had turned into something dangerous. When the Holloways prepared to leave, Elias proposed. Mary hesitated. She was fond of him, yes, but her eyes wandered when Jonah entered the room. The younger brother had a charm Elias never could match, and so, in a moment that would haunt them both, she chose Jonah. Elias didn't speak for 3 days. He wished them well. He even stood beside Jonah at the wedding, Bible in hand, lips trembling as he read the vows. The whole settlement watched in silence, because even the trees seemed to know that nothing good ever comes from 2 brothers loving the same woman. For a time, peace returned. Jonah and Mary built a small cabin by the ridge, a mile from the old Whitlock homestead. Elias visited often, helping with repairs, bringing food from his crops. But inside him something had gone wrong, something twisted and quiet, like rot beneath the bark of a tree. By the following winter, Mary had fallen ill. They said it was a fever, maybe something in the water. The doctor came twice, then refused to return. The roads were frozen, and the mountains were cruel in December. Jonah begged his brother to help, and Elias, ever the faithful one, did everything he could. He prayed, he gathered herbs, he stayed up through the night whispering psalms by her bedside. But when dawn came on the 7th day, Mary Holloway Whitlock was dead. Jonah's scream echoed through the valley. Elias said nothing. He simply closed her eyes, folded her hands over her chest, and whispered, "She's with God now." The funeral was held 3 days later, under a gray sky heavy with snow. Only a handful of people attended. The Holloways had already returned south. Jonah stood frozen beside the coffin, shivering though the fire still burned behind him. When it came time to lower her into the ground, he refused to move. It was Elias who took the shovel, Elias who covered her face in dirt, and Elias who said the final prayer. That night, Jonah disappeared. When dawn broke, his tracks led down to the river. Folks said he'd gone mad with grief, maybe drowned himself in the current. Elias spent the next week searching. Every hill, every creek bend, but found nothing. Then 3 nights later, the door to the Whitlock cabin creaked open. Elias was sitting by the fire when Jonah stepped inside. Soaked, pale and trembling like he'd walked straight out of a grave. His eyes were hollow, voice a whisper. "She's not dead, brother." "I saw her move." Elias froze. He wanted to believe it was grief talking, some fever dream brought on by hunger and guilt. But Jonah insisted. "The coffin was open," he said. The dirt was fresh. She was lying there, looking right at me. He spoke of a faint breath, a twitch of the hand, the sound of nails scraping wood. Elias tried to calm him, to pray with him, but Jonah's madness deepened. He swore that Mary was calling to him in the night, that her voice echoed from the hill where she was buried. He'd vanish for hours, only to return covered in mud, eyes wide with terror. By February, Jonah was gone again. This time, Elias didn't search. He couldn't. Something had begun to stir in his own heart, a whisper he couldn't silence. Some nights he'd wake to the creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle of a dress. He'd smell wildflowers in the room, though the snow was deep outside. And when he'd look toward the window, he'd swear he saw her, Mary, standing just beyond the frost, watching. Days turned to weeks. Neighbors stopped visiting. They said Elias looked thinner, haunted, as if the shadows of the mountain had taken root in his bones. And then one evening, as the sun died behind the peaks, a single knock came at his door. It was Jonah. Only this time, he wasn't alone. In his arms was Mary. Her skin was pale as milk, her lips gray, her eyes open but empty. The smell of earth clung to her dress. Jonah carried her across the threshold like a groom with his bride, and whispered through trembling lips, "She's ours now, brother." Elias fell to his knees, horror and awe twisting through him. Jonah laid her gently by the fire, brushing her hair with shaking hands. "She came back," he said. "She told me she missed us both." The night stretched on, silent, but for the crackle of the fire and the slow, awful sound of breath that didn't belong to the living. Elias wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't. He could only stare, because beneath the flickering light, Mary's hand moved. It reached toward him. And in that moment, the bond that had once united the Whitlock brothers became something darker, something born of love, guilt, and the mountain's cold hunger. When morning came, smoke rose from the chimney of the Whitlock cabin once more. Those who passed by said they heard laughter inside, a woman's laughter, soft and strange. But no one ever saw the brothers again. Only the sound of a shovel sometimes echoing through the fog. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The mountains lay still, blanketed in white, and the only sound was the slow, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair inside the Whitlock cabin. Elias sat near the fire, his hands clasped, his eyes unfocused. Across the room, Jonah whispered softly to Mary's lifeless form, as though she were only sleeping. He brushed her hair, adjusted her shawl, and hummed the same hymn she used to sing on Sunday mornings. The air inside the cabin was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and decay. Elias wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. He had buried that woman with his own hands. He had watched her chest go still, and yet here she was, lying on their mother's quilt, eyes open but unmoving, her skin glistening faintly beneath the firelight. When night fell again, Jonah refused to sleep. "She's cold," he muttered. "The mountain took her warmth, but I can give it back." He wrapped her in his coat, pressing his face against her neck as Elias looked on, torn between horror and pity. Outside, the wind rose again, shrieking through the trees like the mountain itself was warning them to stop. But the Whitlock brothers were long past the point of listening. For the next several days, no one saw them. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but when neighbors passed by, they heard strange sounds, low voices, laughter, and sometimes singing. The preacher from the chapel came once, knocking on their door, but no one answered. He claimed later that he'd seen movement through the window, 2 shadows and a third figure sitting perfectly still between them. After that, he never returned. Inside the cabin, Elias began keeping notes in his father's old Bible, lines scribbled in the margins, prayers that turned into confessions. He wrote of Jonah's delusions, of the voice that seemed to whisper from Mary's still mouth, of dreams that left him shaking. Last night, he wrote, I dreamt of her standing over me, her eyes black as coal. She spoke my name, but it sounded wrong, like the wind forcing its way through broken glass. I woke to find footprints by my bed, small and bare, leading toward the door. Jonah had changed too. His eyes had gone hollow, his laughter erratic. He spoke to Mary constantly, answering questions no one else could hear. Sometimes he'd go out at night, digging at the frozen ground behind the cabin, muttering that she's hungry. Elias tried to reason with him, to pray over him, but Jonah would only sneer. You never loved her like I did, he said once, his voice low and trembling. You wanted her gone. By the third week, the smell inside the cabin had become unbearable. Elias begged his brother to let her rest. This isn't her, he whispered. Whatever you brought back, it's not Mary. But Jonah only smiled faintly, stroking her cold hand. She came back for both of us, brother, he said, and she'll never leave again. That night, Elias woke to a sound that froze his blood. It was a voice, soft, feminine, humming the tune of an old Appalachian lullaby. The same one Mary used to sing. But it wasn't coming from Jonah's room. It was coming from the hearth. He rose slowly, candle trembling in his hand. The fire had long burned out, leaving only embers. And there, curled before the ashes, was Mary's body, motionless, her eyes open and reflecting the faint light. Elias whispered her name once. She blinked. He stumbled back, the candle dropping from his hand. Jonah rushed in, eyes wild. You see? He shouted. You see, she's alive. He fell to his knees beside her, weeping with joy. But Elias saw it clearly now. Mary's lips moved, yes, but not to breathe. Her jaw twitched like something was pulling it from inside, like invisible strings jerking her bones. Her neck bent too far to one side, her fingers scraping against the floorboards, leaving deep, splintered grooves. Elias ran. He didn't stop running until dawn. When he finally reached the old chapel, he burst through the doors, shouting for the preacher. Reverend Holloway, the same man who had once been Mary's father, stared in shock as Elias fell to his knees, gasping, She's moving. Jonah brought her back. The Reverend's face went pale. He'd heard tales of such things before, mountain legends whispered by old folk who claimed the soil itself could bind the soul if love and guilt were strong enough. He spoke of the restless dead, spirits called back by those who refused to let go. You must bury her again, he said gravely. This time with prayer and salt. And do not look back. Elias nodded, trembling. But when he returned to the cabin that night, Jonah was gone again. The door hung open. The fire had burned out, and Mary's body was nowhere to be found. Elias searched until his feet bled, calling his brother's name into the fog. Somewhere in the woods he heard laughter, low, distant, echoing between the trees. It wasn't Jonah's laugh. It was softer, higher, familiar. Elias, the voice came from the dark. Why did you bury me? He turned, heart pounding. For a moment, he saw her, the outline of a woman standing between the trees, her dress tattered, her hair drifting like smoke in the cold wind. And beside her, Jonah holding her hand, smiling faintly. Elias screamed for him to stop, to let her go. But Jonah only looked back once, eyes glistening. She's ours now, he whispered again. You can't take her from us. Then they vanished into the woods. For days Elias searched. The mountain air grew colder, sharper, filled with the smell of rain and rot. He found their footprints leading toward an old mine shaft, one that had been sealed for years after their father's death. The boards were torn away, the ground disturbed. A candle flickered inside. He entered slowly, whispering prayers. The air was damp, the walls slick with moss. Somewhere deep inside, he heard the sound of humming again, the same lullaby. Hush, my darling. Don't you cry. It grew louder with every step, until he reached the chamber where the lantern burned. Jonah sat there, cross-legged on the ground, Mary beside him. Her head rested on his shoulder, her hair hanging like wet threads. He looked up at Elias and smiled weakly. She's better now, he said. She remembers everything. Elias stared in horror. Mary's eyes were open, but not human anymore. They glowed faintly, catching the lantern light in a way that made them seem alive and dead all at once. Her lips moved, whispering something Elias couldn't hear. He took a step back. "Jonah," he pleaded, "this isn't love. It's blasphemy." Jonah laughed softly. "You don't understand," he said. The mountain gave her back. It just asked for something in return. The air grew cold. Elias felt a presence behind him, a weight, a silence so deep it pressed against his ribs. The flame flickered, bending toward the tunnel like it was being pulled. Mary turned her head toward him slowly, with a sickening creak of bone. "Stay with us," she whispered. "We're a family again." Elias ran. He didn't remember leaving the mine, only the sound of his own screams echoing through the hollow. By morning, the entrance had collapsed. No one ever found Jonah or Mary again, but Elias never left the mountain. Years later, travelers would speak of a man living alone by the ridge, a gray-bearded hermit who muttered to himself and carved crosses into trees. He kept salt in jars by his door, burned sage through the night, and warned anyone who'd listen, "Don't love the dead. The mountain keeps what it takes." Some said he'd gone mad. Others believed him, because on quiet nights when the fog rolled low and the wind carried the sound of old hymns through the valley, people swore they could see them, two figures walking hand in hand near the old mine. A man and a woman, and sometimes, just behind them, a shadow that never seemed to stop following. It was said that Elias died in the winter of 1902. When the townsfolk found his cabin, they discovered something carved into the wall beside his bed. "She came back for both of us. Now she won't let either of us go." And beneath those words, burned into the wood, were 3 sets of initials: EWJWMH. No one could explain how the last set appeared. The wood was old, untouched, and cold as stone. To this day, the Whitlock cabin still stands, half collapsed, swallowed by vines, hidden deep in the Appalachian hills. Locals avoid it. They say that if you stand there long enough, you'll hear a woman humming and 2 men arguing softly in the dark. And if you're foolish enough to open the door, you'll find a rocking chair still moving and footprints leading toward the woods, 3 sets, side by side. By the turn of the century, the Whitlock story had become a whisper, a mountain legend told to children by firelight. Most dismissed it as backwoods superstition, a tale meant to keep lovers faithful and men from playing with what lay beneath the soil. But legends have a way of clinging to truth, the way fog clings to stone. And in 1923, when a young historian named Samuel Harlan arrived in the hills of eastern Kentucky, that truth began to stir again. Samuel was 29, tall and thin, with a face that hadn't yet learned how to hide curiosity. He'd grown up in the city, Lexington, where the air was full of ink and ambition, and had come to Appalachia chasing stories for a university project about rural myth and mortality. His professors wanted documentation. Samuel wanted something else, proof. The locals were wary of him. They spoke little, watched much, and shut their doors early. The mountains, they said, weren't kind to strangers after dark. But it was at the old tavern near Red Hollow that Samuel first heard the name Whitlock. An old woman, half blind and wrapped in shawls, muttered it while stirring her tea. "You stay away from them woods," she said. "Ain't nothing there but bones and sorrow." The mountain remembers that family. Samuel leaned closer. "What family?" She didn't answer directly, only smiled a toothless smile and whispered, "The brothers who married the same corpse." It should have been a joke, but her tone wasn't playful. It was mournful. That night, in his rented cabin, Samuel read through an old parish ledger he'd borrowed from the chapel. Names faded, ink bled by rain. But there they were, Elias Whitlock, Jonah Whitlock, and Mary Holloway, recorded in the winter of 1859. Next to Jonah's name, a single word had been written in another hand. Decades later, missing. The next morning, Samuel hiked toward the ridge. The woods were thick, silent but for the hum of insects and the distant rush of a river. It took him half a day to reach the spot locals called Whitlock Hollow. There wasn't much left, just the remains of a stone chimney and a few blackened logs swallowed by vines. The cabin had collapsed long ago, but its presence lingered in the stillness, like the air itself remembered. Samuel took notes, photographs, sketches. Yet as the afternoon faded, he felt something shift. The wind changed direction, cold, sharp, sudden. The forest went quiet, and then he saw it. Half buried in the dirt near the chimney, the corner of a wooden board. He brushed away the soil and revealed letters carved deep into the surface. EW, JW, MH. He froze. The same initials mentioned in the legend. The same ones burned into the wall, if the stories were true. The wood was old, yes, but not decayed. Not like the rest. He touched it with his gloved hand and swore he felt warmth, faint but pulsing, like the heartbeat of something sleeping. That night he stayed in the valley despite the locals' warnings. He lit a small fire, set up his tent beside the ruins, and opened his journal. The forest around him whispered. Wind moved through branches like breath. He wrote until the ink began to blur. "There's something alive here," he wrote. "Not animal. Not ghost. It feels..." Remembered. At some point he must have fallen asleep. He woke to the sound of humming. Soft, low, familiar. An old Appalachian lullaby carried by the wind. He sat up, heart hammering. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. Someone or something was walking near the edge of the trees. The shape was faint, white against the dark. A woman barefoot, hair long and tangled, moving with a strange, gentle rhythm. Samuel called out. She turned. The firelight caught her face, and his breath vanished. She wasn't young, but not old either. Her skin pale as wax, her eyes glassy and still. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a rasp, a breath too deep, as though spoken through the throat of the earth itself. "Don't stay here," she whispered. He's still waiting. And then she was gone. The next morning, Samuel found fresh footprints near his camp, bare, small, and leading toward the woods. He followed them for nearly a mile until they stopped abruptly at a collapsed mine entrance. The same one the legend described. His pulse quickened. He dropped to his knees, brushing away loose stones, revealing a small gap wide enough to crawl through. From inside came the faint smell of wet soil and something older, something metallic, like rusted blood. He lit his lantern and entered. The shaft was narrow and twisted, the air thick and cold. Every sound, the drip of water, the crunch of gravel, felt amplified. As he descended, he found remnants, a broken shovel, a decayed Bible, and the faint outline of crosses carved into the wall. He reached the chamber at the end and froze. There were 3 shapes there. 2 skeletons, side by side, half covered in earth, one larger, one smaller, and a third form leaning against the wall. That one wasn't bone, it was preserved. Perfectly. A woman's body, her face untouched by time, her dress still clinging to her like it had been laid down yesterday. Samuel stumbled back, choking on disbelief. The legend, it was all true. The lantern flickered. A whisper echoed. "Who disturbs our rest?" He spun around, light trembling. Nothing, just the dark pressing close. But when he turned back toward the bodies, the woman's eyes were open. He ran. He didn't stop until daylight, collapsing near the base of the hill. Locals found him the next afternoon, raving, mud-streaked, shaking. They said he kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "She's still alive." She never died. They took him to a hospital in Lexington where he remained for 3 weeks, muttering in his sleep about 2 shadows and a song that doesn't end. The university dismissed his claims as hysteria. His journal was confiscated, his photographs lost in a fire a year later. But Samuel Harlan never recovered. He returned once more to Appalachia in 1926, determined to prove what he'd seen. He was never seen again. Decades passed. The Whitlock Hollow grew wilder, forgotten by all but hunters and drifters. Yet every few years someone would vanish near those woods. Their belongings would be found neatly folded by the riverbank, their names etched into trees, as if by invisible hands. In 1971, a geologist surveying the area for coal reported hearing voices underground. When his team excavated the collapsed shaft, they uncovered a tunnel sealed by salt and wooden planks arranged like a cross. Inside, they found nothing, only the faint echo of a woman's laughter and a carved inscription on the wall. "She came back for both of us. Now she has all of us." After that, the government marked the site as restricted due to geological instability. Locals knew better. They said the mountain wasn't unstable. It was alive. Now, more than a century and a half after that night in 1859, the Whitlock legend still lingers. Travelers speak of strange lights moving through the forest, of a melody carried on the wind, and of seeing 3 figures standing together near the ridge. A tall man, a younger man, and a woman between them, her hands entwined with theirs. And when the fog rolls thickest, if you listen close, you might hear a whisper that freezes the blood. Love never dies, it just waits. Those who live nearby still avoid the hollow after dark. They say the soil there is soft as if it's been freshly turned, and the air smells faintly of lilies and smoke. And some claim that if you dare to place your ear against the earth, you'll hear them breathing. The winter of 1861 came early that year, sweeping down from the Blue Ridge like a ghost in a tattered cloak. The mountains howled with wind that slipped through the cracks of every window, every crevice, every human soul still trapped in that haunted valley. By then, people had stopped calling the twins by name. To the children, they were simply the Widow brothers. To the elders, they were a warning. But to those who lived close enough to hear the wind moaning through their broken home at night, they were a curse made flesh. After Martha's second burial, the town of Pine Ridge did not speak of her again. The preacher refused to perform another sermon for her, saying that what is laid to rest twice cannot be blessed again. But the brothers, Amos and Elijah Boone, refused to move on. Amos would sit outside in the cold, rocking slowly on the porch, staring at the woods where her grave rested. Elijah would vanish for hours, sometimes days, into those same trees, coming back pale and trembling, his boots soaked through with mud that smelled faintly of death. Something had bound them both to that grave, something neither could name nor escape. One night in late December, Elijah came home with a look on his face that made Amos rise from his chair. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, shaking, his breath fogging in the cold air. When he finally spoke, his voice was dry as old wood. "She's not there," he whispered. Amos frowned. "What you mean?" "The grave," Elijah said, trembling. "It's empty." Amos laughed once, a broken sound. "You've gone mad. I saw it, brother. I swear on God himself I saw it. The dirt's been dug up, the box is open, and there ain't no body." Amos's laughter stopped. For a long moment the only sound was the wind pressing against the windows, howling like a voice trying to get in. By morning, both men were on horseback, riding through the snow-blanketed woods toward the cemetery. The forest was dead silent, save for the creak of the saddles and the dull thud of hooves. When they reached the small clearing where Martha had been buried, twice, the snow was disturbed, churned up by something dragging through it. The headstone was cracked, leaning forward like it was trying to hide its shame, and the coffin lay open. But it wasn't empty. Inside was a tattered wedding dress, damp and clinging to the bottom of the box, as though it had been pulled in and left to rot. No bones, no body, just that dress faintly smelling of lilac and grave dirt. Elijah fell to his knees, gripping the edge of the coffin. "She's gone, Amos. Someone's taken her." Amos stared for a long time. Then slowly he said, "Or she left." That night, back at the cabin, Amos began to speak of things that made Elijah's skin crawl. "She weren't meant to die here," he said softly, staring at the fire. "She was bound to us, to both of us. You feel it too, don't you?" Elijah didn't answer. "You dream of her," Amos continued. "Every night. Same as me, she calls us. Sometimes gentle, sometimes angry." Elijah turned sharply. "You stop that talk right now." But Amos only smiled, a cracked, hollow smile. "You can't stop hearing her either, can you?" That was the first night Elijah slept with a knife under his pillow. Days turned into weeks, and the snow grew higher, sealing them into their cabin like tomb walls. The brothers barely spoke. When they did, it was always about her. They would argue over who she loved more, who she belonged to, as if she were still alive somewhere out in those woods. Elijah began finding strange footprints outside the cabin each morning, barefoot, delicate, and half-frozen. Once, he swore he saw the imprint of a hand pressed against the window. The glass fogged from the inside. He tried to tell Amos, but Amos just whispered, "She's come back home." Then one night, Elijah woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. He grabbed his lantern and stumbled into the main room. The cold rushed in like a living thing, and there and standing in the doorway was Amos, barefoot, eyes wide, smiling faintly. "She called me," Amos whispered. "She said she's waiting." Elijah reached for him, but Amos turned and stepped out into the snow, disappearing into the trees without another word. Elijah followed the tracks until dawn. The forest was silent, no birds, no wind, no sign of life. Only Amos's footprints leading deeper and deeper into the hollow. They ended at the old cemetery, where the grave still gaped open. But Amos was nowhere to be found. Elijah screamed his brother's name until his throat was raw, and then he heard it, faintly, from somewhere deep underground. A sound like a man's voice, muffled, desperate, and then gone. When he returned home that morning, Elijah burned the wedding dress. He sat beside the fire and watched it blacken and crumble to ash, whispering prayers he no longer believed. But even as the last thread burned away, the air filled with a faint scent of lilac, and from the woods, just beyond the edge of dawn, came the faint sound of two voices, one pleading, one laughing. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the end of that winter, Elijah Boone was no longer seen in Pine Ridge. Some said he followed the voice into the woods and never came back. Others claimed he went north to forget what he'd seen. But the cabin remained, empty, rotting, its door swinging gently in the wind. And sometimes, when the snow fell heavy, travelers swore they saw two men outside that cabin, standing beside a woman in white. Her veil flowing like smoke, her eyes dark as the mountain shadow. They stand there side by side, waiting for someone to call their names. The spring of 1862 came with the scent of wet pine and sorrow. By then, Pine Ridge was dying. The Civil War had swallowed up every young man who could still stand, leaving behind only the old, the broken, and the haunted. The Boone cabin, half swallowed by moss and silence, had become a wound in the valley, a place where even the wind moved carefully, afraid to wake what might still be listening. No one had seen Elijah Boone for months. Some whispered that he'd gone mad and wandered into the mountains to die. Others said he'd become a preacher of strange things, walking from town to town, preaching not of God but of the veil between life and death, and how love could tear it apart. And yet, on a fog-thick night that spring, something began stirring again in the hollow. Old Marjorie Cutter, who lived 3 ridges over, was the first to speak of it. She swore she saw a lantern burning in the Boone cabin, steady, golden, and faint, like the heart of something trying to remember how to live. The next morning she found footprints leading down to the riverbank. Not 1 pair, but 2. Barefoot, wet, fresh. By the 3rd night, the church bell began ringing on its own. It sounded hollow and uneven, as though someone were tugging the rope with broken fingers. And on the 4th, a farmer claimed he saw 3 figures walking the ridge above town, 2 men and a woman in white, moving slowly against the mist. People stopped going out after dusk. Children whispered rhymes about the corpse bride and the twin widows who danced with her by moonlight. But no one dared go near the Boone cabin. Not anymore. Then, on the 14th of April, a young blacksmith named Walter Hennings rode out toward the hollow. He was new to Pine Ridge, didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or the Boone legend. He was chasing a rumor that the cabin had silver buried under the floorboards, a relic of the Boone brothers' old family fortune. He carried a pistol, a lantern, and a reckless confidence that comes only from youth. He reached the cabin at sunset. The door was hanging open, moving slightly in the mountain breeze. Inside, the smell of damp wood and mildew clung to everything. Dust floated in the air like old memories. The hearth was dead cold, but there were footprints in the ash. Bare human footprints. He crouched, lantern trembling in his hand. The prints led toward the back room, the bedroom. Walter pushed the door open, and what he saw froze him where he stood. There was a bed in the center of the room, covered in tattered sheets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But lying across it was a wedding dress, torn, yellowed with age, and still wet, as though it had just come out of the earth. The mirror on the far wall was fogged over from within. And then, behind him, the floorboards creaked. When they found Walter Hennings 3 days later, he was stumbling through the woods, clothes soaked, eyes wide and empty. He couldn't speak at first, just shook and whispered fragments of words no one could piece together. Finally, after days of fevered muttering, he managed to say one thing. They were dancing. He claimed he saw 2 men, twins, holding the hands of a woman in a ruined dress. They spun slowly, silently, as if underwater. Their faces, he said, were pale and smiling, but their eyes were gone. The woman's veil fluttered even though there was no wind. When Walter tried to speak to them, the woman turned her head toward him, and that's when he saw that her lips were stitched shut. The sheriff dismissed it as madness brought on by fever. But the townsfolk knew better. They'd heard that same story before, in different words, from different mouths. As months passed, more travelers went missing along the old ridge trail. Their horses were found wandering alone, their saddles empty, their belongings untouched. Every time someone vanished, the church bell rang at midnight, a single, hollow toll that echoed down the valley like a heartbeat. The preacher, Father Emery, tried to bless the Boone land. He gathered 6 men, armed with torches and crosses, and rode out one evening toward the cabin. They didn't return until dawn. They wouldn't speak of what they saw. All Father Emery said, pale and trembling, was, "The Lord does not dwell there." After that, the church closed its doors for good. By 1863, the war had reached the edges of Appalachia. The valley was scarred by loss, famine, and death. But even amid the chaos, the Boone story endured, passed quietly from family to family like a secret no one dared write down. It was said that sometimes, when fog rolled low through the pines, you could still see them, 2 brothers walking side by side, one taller, one leaner, their clothes dark and tattered, their eyes hollow, and between them, a woman in white. Not floating, not ghostly, just walking, as though she belonged to both of them, and to none at all. Some swore that if you called her name, Martha, she would turn, slowly, and whisper your name in return. And then, within 3 nights, you'd hear scratching at your window, but the sound would come from inside. Years later, a group of railway workers clearing trees for a new track near Pine Ridge found something buried beneath a cluster of oak roots, an old wooden box. Inside were 2 rusted wedding rings and a small locket engraved with the initials A.B. and E.B., Amos and Elijah Boone. But the real horror lay beneath. When they dug deeper, they unearthed 3 skeletons, 2 men, 1 woman, all bound together by a length of braided hair, long brown, and perfectly preserved. The bones were reburied under a single stone marked only with 1 word, together. Still, even now, more than a century later, hikers who wander too deep into those Appalachian woods sometimes return pale, shaken, their eyes darting to the trees. They speak of hearing faint laughter, or of seeing 3 shadows beneath the moon, twined together, swaying slowly to a tune no living ear can hear. Some say love can outlast death, but in Pine Ridge, they learned that love, though once broken, can outlive God himself. There's a saying that echoes through the old Appalachian hollows even today. The mountain never forgets what it's fed. And by 1874, the mountain had not forgotten the Boone brothers, nor the woman they had buried, loved and lost twice. Pinneridge was no longer a living town by then. War had taken its sons, hunger its families, and superstition its peace. The church stood in ruins, vines crawling up its walls like fingers reaching for heaven. The Boone cabin had sunk halfway into the soil, its roof collapsed, its windows black with mold. But when the wind swept through those woods, it still carried something human. Whispers too soft to name, and a smell faintly of lilac. No one had lived near that hollow in years. Yet every spring, someone found flowers, wild lilacs, freshly picked, laid neatly across the Boone grave. No one ever saw who left them. No one ever dared to ask. It was in that same year, 1874, that a traveling preacher named Silas Hart arrived in Pine Ridge. He was young, sharp-eyed, full of God's words and confidence, believing no story too cursed to be redeemed. He'd heard of the Boone legend from an innkeeper in Tennessee, 2 brothers who married the same woman, then followed her into the grave. Hart thought it superstition until he saw the cabin for himself. He came at dusk, when the light was soft and gold, and the forest seemed to breathe. The cabin leaned to one side, its door hanging open as if inviting him in. Dust floated through the light, thick as snow. The air smelled like wet iron and old perfume. He took a step inside, his boots sinking into rotted floorboards, and found 3 things upon the table: untouched by time. A rusted lantern, 2 rings, and a locket. He opened the locket slowly. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, both men. Identical. The Boone brothers. Between their faces, faintly pressed into the glass, was a third image, barely visible, faded by decades. A woman, veiled, her face turned ever so slightly toward the viewer. It was then that the preacher heard something, soft, low, like breath against his ear. "She chose us both." He turned. No one was there. He left that night shaken, but he couldn't sleep. The story gnawed at him, demanding to be told. So he returned the next day with his journal and a small wooden cross to plant beside the ruins, a symbol of peace for the dead. But when he reached the clearing, something was different. The air was colder, the light dimmer, and where the cabin had stood the night before, there was nothing. Only a depression in the ground, as if the earth had swallowed it whole. The preacher dropped to his knees, clawing through the soil, calling out scripture like a man drowning. Then beneath the dirt, his fingers touched wood. He brushed it away and realized it wasn't a coffin. It was a door. It creaked open when he pulled, leading down into darkness. He lit his lantern. The air that rose up was ancient, damp, heavy with the scent of decay. The passage wound down into a small chamber carved from the earth, walls lined with roots, the floor uneven and slick. And in the center, 3 figures sat around a wooden table. 2 men, 1 woman. The lantern flame trembled. Their skin was pale as chalk, their eyes closed, as though in prayer. Their hands were linked, bone to bone, flesh melted together by time. The woman's hair, still brown and full, was braided between the brothers' fingers, binding them forever. On the wall behind them, scratched deep into the dirt, were 4 words. "We are still together." The preacher ran. He dropped his lantern, and the flames spread across the ground, catching the roots like fuse lines. Fire roared through the chamber, and the mountain exhaled a long, hollow sigh, as though it had been waiting for this release. By dawn, nothing was left but a smoking pit and the faint scent of lilac drifting through the air. Silas Hart left Pine Ridge that morning and never preached again. They said he spent the rest of his days wandering, warning anyone who'd listen. Love is no blessing when it forgets to die. Years turned into decades. The war ended. Towns rose and fell and the world moved on. But travelers who passed through that stretch of the Appalachian Trail still spoke of strange things, of music heard through fog, of lanterns swaying in the dark, and of a woman's voice singing a wordless song that made the heart ache and the blood run cold. They say if you follow the sound, it leads to a clearing where nothing grows, just a circle of blackened soil. And if you stand there long enough, you'll feel a warmth behind you, like someone breathing against your neck. If you turn around, you might see them, 2 men identical, standing close together, and between them, a woman in a tattered wedding gown, her veil fluttering like smoke. They don't speak. They don't move. They only watch, bound together by something deeper than love, older than death. And when the wind passes through the hollow, it carries their vow, whispering softly through the trees. Till death, and after. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.